As Hugh said, we're going to talk about techniques to increase pregnancy rates, and there's a whole lot of different things we can do, both in more traditional weather pattern years and then after a drought year, and that's really what I'm going to focus on today, is what are some of the things we do after a drought year. But before we get to that, we need to think, what are some of the factors that affect pregnancy rate? And Dr. Gill did a good job before lunch of setting me up with this presentation, but probably the biggest one is going to be nutrition, and we'll talk about exactly what we're talking about from a nutrition standpoint. And then if we're talking about replacement heifers, we'd be talking about weight and age, and we'll look at that. And then disease. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but that's something we can't forget about, because even if we have those cows right from a nutritional standpoint, from a developmental standpoint on those replacement heifers, if we don't have that herd health program in place, then we have risk of abortions or early embryonic loss. And even when we do have a good herd health program in place, occasionally we still have some of these problems. I'll tell you, in our family operation, I actually got in a situation last fall where we'd lost a couple fetuses to abortions. Probably lepto-abortions is what we decided it most likely was, but even with a good program in place, some of those things are possible. But the big thing by having that program in place, rather than the whole herd and having 10 or 15 or 20% abortion rate, we only looked at about 3% in that situation. Heterosis, Dr. Gill talked about that earlier, as far as when we crossbreed cattle, we increase fertility, especially on the female side, which is something we always want to try to take advantage of when we can. And then environment. And he talked about the environment from the standpoint of that bull and heat stress and what it could do to semen quality. But the other thing is that bull worried about breeding cows or staying cool when it's hot? He's worried about staying cool, not about breeding those cows. Or on the cow side, we can have some problems there, and those females just don't express esters as well, and we can have some fertility issues. And then genetics, we have some breeds or some lines of cattle that are just more fertile than others. But the ones we're really going to focus on is nutrition and then some manipulation from some things we can do. Now, when we think about pregnancy rates, it's always the female side everybody wants to think and talk about. But we always have to remember it takes a cow and a bull both to get the job done. And so we need to think about these bulls coming out of that drought. Do we have them in the appropriate condition? Have we done that fertility exam on them to make sure they're fertile? Are their feet and legs in good shape? Are their eyes in good shape? Yesterday morning, I treated a bull for pink eye. Do you think that bull's going to breed as well as one that didn't have pink eye? No, those are issues. So whether we're talking about visual or structural or just reproductive fertility issues, we need to think about those bulls. What kind of condition do we want those bulls to be in going into the breeding season? Somebody give me an answer. What body condition do you think we want them in? 6? 5? Do we want those bulls out of 7 or 8? No, way too fat. But on the other side of that equation, we don't want those bulls in a body conditions 3 or 4 going into the breeding season either. So just like the cows, we want those bulls in moderate condition, and typically I'd shoot for somewhere between 5 and 6 on those bulls starting out the breeding season. When we talk about replacement heifers, what do we need to do to make sure we have high pregnancy rates in those females, especially when we think about the cow herd being short and trying to retain some extra females and getting as many of them bred as we can? One of the things we talk about is target breeding points or goals. What are their goals to have that female at from an optimum standpoint to increase reproduction? And if we're going to have those females calved for the first time at 2 years of age, we're going to rebreed them at about 14 to 15 months of age. So if that's what we're looking at from an age standpoint, what are we looking at from a developmental standpoint? Well, what we talk about is wanting those females to be 65% of mature body weight. So if that heifer is going to develop into a mature cow, and we talk about a mature cow being about 5 years of age, and then a moderate body condition score 5. At that point in time, if she's going to be about 1,200 pounds as a mature cow, we want those heifers to be at least 65% of mature body weight when we go to breed on those females. So a 1,200 pound cow, if we take that and multiply by 65%, that tells us we want those females to be at least 780 pounds when we get ready to start breeding on them. Now, do we want them at that weight the day we're going to breed them? No, ideally we want them there a few weeks before so we get 1 or 2 cycles under their belt before we actually turn in the bull. So proper development of those heifers is key. Now, what if you had a 1,000 pound cow? Well, then we're looking at only needing that heifer develop to 650 pounds before we get ready for the breeding season. And if you really pay attention to the popular press you've seen over the last few years, there's been some talk of maybe we don't need to develop these heifers up to 65%. And you hear some people talking about maybe 55%. And I guess I really don't follow that line of thinking when you really look and evaluate those studies and look at the little bit of money they're saving from a developmental standpoint, and then you look at the pregnancy rates. I can't justify that in my mind, especially as was mentioned by Dr. Gill this morning when we think about what calves are worth these days. So I definitely want them at least 65%. The other thing that's real different with our cow herd compared to where you hear some of that talk about is we have some Brahman influence in our females, which is a very valuable thing because it gives us some of that heterosis. It gives us some of that environmental adaptability. But one of the things that comes along with those Brahman females is they tend to be a little later maturing. So definitely on those females, we want to be at this or maybe a little bit more. So 65% is going to be our target at breeding. And a lot of people think about that, but the one they forget about is what do we need to do with that heifer once we get her bred? Do we need to have her continue to grow? Well, absolutely. We need to make sure when we get ready to calve that we have her at about 85% of her mature weight. And by doing that, we can reduce some calving problems and also do a better job of getting that female to breed back as that first cow. So if we look at 85% of mature body weight, and again, we think about that 1,200 pound mature cow, we're going to want that female to be about 1,020 pounds at calving is where we want her at from a developmental standpoint. And I always get the question from people, well, I don't want to feed those heifers too much when they're bred because if I do, I'm going to have bigger calves. Well, in reality, that's not really the case. You may occasionally put 1 or 2 pounds more on that heifer, but that heifer is going to sacrifice her nutrition to make sure she develops that calf to the best of her ability. So when you underfeed those heifers, you have a calf that's the same size, but you have a heifer that's not developed as much, and so you actually increase your calving problems in that situation. So do make sure you get these heifers developed properly after breeding and on up until calving. Other thing I'm going to spend a fair bit of time on here is body conditioning. We've talked about nutrition this morning and how it's so important from reproduction, but one of the ways we can measure where we're at from a nutrition standpoint in a cow herd is what we call body condition score. And some of you may be familiar with this, but just to get everybody on the same page, body condition score in beef cows, we score those cows from a 1 to a 9, with a 1 being some bone with some hide hanging over it. And in reality, there's absolutely no reason any of us should ever see any of those cows in the industry. There's no place for them. But unfortunately, last summer, there were quite a few of those cows running around. And on the other end of that equation is what we would call the body condition score 9 cow. And that's an obese cow. And most likely, she hasn't had a calf for at least 1 in probably multiple years. And then in the middle is what we call the body condition score 5 cow. And we'll actually look at one of those here in a minute because depending on the body condition score of these cows will influence some of the techniques we may choose to implement to improve our reproductive rates. But where are we going to look at on that cow to evaluate body condition? And we're not evaluating how full she is, how big around her belly is, or how thick she is from a muscle standpoint. What we're evaluating is, has she lost any muscle from being too thin, and then how much fat cover does she have on her? And so one place we would look would be down in the brisket. Another place we'd look is over the ribs. How easily can we see the ribs of those cattle? We'll look down the back so we can look at the spine and how visible are the vertebrae, are they nice and covered up. Another spot we'll look is at the hook bone, which is what we refer to as the hip bone in cattle, and then pins, and we'll look at the area between those. And then right in front of that hook bone, where we kind of have that little pocket, we have where you can really see the backbone, we have what we call a transverse spinous process. And the transverse spinous processes are the ones that are going to be coming straight out kind of horizontal, whereas the spine, the spinous process is going to be straight up. And if you think about that area, that's where we're getting a T-bone steak from. So that's what you're actually looking at, is the bone structure from that T-bone steak. And that would be right in that area, and we'll look at it in some detail. And then on each side of the tail head, as cattle start to accumulate more fat and more condition, they'll actually store some of that fat in fat pones on each side of the tail head. But where I wanted to start at with here is I skipped over body condition score 1 and 2 cow, because hopefully none of you have any of those, but if you do, we're going to have to take some pretty drastic measures. But I wanted to get your eye set to a body condition score 3 cow and then build from that. When we look at this cow in a body condition score 3, we can see her bone structure pretty easily. So you see her shoulder, you can see the shoulder blade. The ribs you can see, they're maybe a little hard to see in this picture because this cow has actually been in such poor condition, she hasn't done a good job of shedding her hair coat out, which is something we have to make sure we do, is look through that hair and make sure we actually look at the meat and bone. And then her backbone or her spine is sticking up really well. Her transverse spinous processes that we can see here, you can actually see each individual one. And if you think about, if you're going to get a T-bone out of that area, you're not going to have very much meat to eat. It's going to be just a very little meat because she's actually atrophied some muscle tissue in that situation. Her hook bone's real easy to see. The pin bone's real easy to see, and you can actually see the bone structure on this rear leg. But from hooks to pins, she actually sinks in. And the reason she sinks in there is she's lost some of her muscle mass because she's used that to try to meet some of her nutritional needs. So that's a body condition score 3 cow. What do we think that cow's going to do from a reproduction standpoint? We'll just kind of keep that in your mind and we'll answer that in just a minute. Here's another body condition score 3 cow, but this one doesn't have hair on her. And so we look at her, we can see that, and again you can see the shoulder blades real easy. This picture you can see the ribs a little bit better, and on those body condition score 3 cows, you're definitely going to see all the back ribs, you'll see the middle ribs, and you may even start to see those 4 ribs being visible a little bit. Again, you can, if you look real close, you can make out the individual transverse spinous process there. Look how sharp that pin bone is and that hook bone, and then how she's atrophied or she dips in with muscle between hooks and pins. So 2 different body condition score 3 cows for you to look at and kind of get in your mind. Then we go up to a body condition score 4 cow. So still a little thinner than what we would probably like, but carrying a little more condition. In this female, her shoulder sticks out a little bit more than what we'll see a lot of times on those body condition score 4 cows, but that's why we look at 5 or 6 different spots to the side. But on this cow, if you look at her, you can't see any 4 ribs, you can't see any of the middle ribs, but you can see the last 2 or 3 ribs on that female. When we look at her transverse spinous process here, you won't be able to see the individual ones, but you'll have a nice thin line where we actually have some muscle coming back in there, but we haven't totally filled back out with muscle, and we don't have any fat cover. From hooks to pins, she's still sunk in, but not quite as much, and you can't see that structure on her rear leg. So, much better condition than the cows we were looking at before. Another body condition score 4 cow, but what's different about this one? There's something real obvious. Who's awake? Okay, what do we have here versus what do we have there? Hair versus no hair, right? So I put this in here so you can see one of these cows with hair. You have to look through that hair. A lot of people get real surprised. They look at the cows and they think they're in pretty good condition, and then we get some rain and they look at the cows and they panic because they thought they lost a body condition score and a half overnight. Well, no, she was that thin before it rained. It's just easier for you to see after the rain. So make sure you look through it. If you look real close, you can kind of see the outlines of the last few ribs on this cow. From hooks to pins, she dips in a little bit, but then that pin bone's pretty sharp. So that would make her a body condition score 4. And then we move from there, body condition score 5 cow. And this is kind of our moderate, middle of the road cow. And as you're beginning to think about body condition score, this is really what I want you to set your eye to. Because if you can tell what a body condition score 5 cow is and recognize her, well, then we can say it's either fatter than a body condition score 5 or thinner than a body condition score 5 cow. But on a 5, we won't be able to see any ribs. We won't be able to see those transverse spinous process. We filled in pretty good for muscle there. From hooks to pins, she's actually level. She's filled muscle back in, so she's level from hooks to pins, but just a cow that looks like she's in pretty good condition. As we move up, and I didn't include those pictures in here, but a body condition score 6 cows actually putting on some more fat, and especially around the tail head, you'll start getting some fat pones there. So if you see something with fat pones, that's a pretty good indicator to you that it's at least a body condition score 6 or better. Well, why did I make such a big deal about body condition score? Well, the reason being is it's the #1 driver when we think about pregnancy rates, assuming we don't have some kind of a major disease outbreak or something like that. But if we look at effects of body condition score on pregnancy rates, and this is actually some data from some matured cattle in Florida, but you can take studies all across the country and you'll see this exact same pattern. Well, we look at these cows in a body condition score 2, we're looking at 10 to 15% pregnancy rates. How many of you can survive with those kind of pregnancy rates in your operation? None of us can, and that's what really got me about the people who didn't really supplement those cows or take care of them during a drought. Well, yeah, they saved some money on feed, but they're going to lose a massive amount of money this year because they're not going to have calves to sell next year to pay for everything. We go from a body condition score 2 to 3, we increase those pregnancy rates, but we're still well below 40% there. We go from a 3 to 4, we increase it again. From a 4 to 5, we increase it again, but not quite as much. And then from a 5 to 6, small increase, but not too much. So that's traditionally what we think about on mature cows. And when I talk about a mature cow from a body condition score standpoint, I'm going to be thinking of those cows that are 4 or older. And so typically we want to have those cows in a body condition score of 5 or greater at calving to optimize reproduction rates. How many of you had those cows as fat as you would have liked them this year? Okay, notice I didn't raise my hand either. Okay, we were in a bad situation too, and the cows were a little thinner than what we would have liked them to come through the winter typically, and that'll have some impact on our reproduction. You notice we still increase a little bit as we go up from a body condition score standpoint, and if from a grass standpoint we can get these cows up here to 6 or 7, absolutely nothing wrong with that. Historically, we would have said we would want to spend the money from a supplementation standpoint to try to get them up here, but as was alluded to earlier, we're looking at a little different economic times, and when we're selling $600 to $800 or $900 calves off the cow, we may want to look at having those cows in a little better condition and bumping that pregnancy rate a couple percentage points. All right, so given that, we need to think about what are we going to do to mitigate those low body condition scores when we calve those calves. Let me back up for just a second and really hammer home this point. Body condition score at calving has the biggest impact of your pregnancy rates of anything. Now, a lot of people want to think about body condition score during the breeding season, and I'm not saying it's not important, but the key thing is body condition score at calving. Now, are you going to increase body condition on those cows once they calve? In most years, no, okay? Well, what about this year? Well, if you think back to James Rogers' presentation this morning, he made the comment that it was one of the best years we've ever had from a winter annual standpoint. And I would agree totally. And this actually helped us quite a bit because normally when we haven't been able to put condition on those cows when they have calves on them, because of all that green grass we had this year, we actually maintain weight pretty good. And in some situations, we put a little condition on some cows, which helped us. But even with that, if those cows were too thin at calving, we still need to think about some other management techniques we may need to implement. This helped us a bunch, but it didn't totally solve all of our problems. And the reason being, and as we think about this, when we think about the nutrient priorities of a cow once she calves, where is she going to send her nutrients to first? Well, a lot of people like to say maintenance, and that actually kind of drives me nuts because that cow's not worried about maintaining her body weight after calving. Now, she's worried about surviving, so initially that's where her nutrients are going to go to make sure she survives. From there, she's going to produce milk, and lactation is where her nutrients are going to go. And then on down the list of her priorities are going to be reproduction and body condition score. And if she's in appropriate shape, then reproduction is going to be next. If not, she's actually going to try to get some condition back on before her body senses she's in good enough shape to start cycling and getting rebred. So that's why we have to make sure we get those cows in appropriate condition before calving, because after calving, that cow's more worried about survival and lactation than she is about reproduction. Well, what are some of the options we can implement to try to help get these thinner cows rebred? Well, one of them is what we would call 48-hour calf removal. And what we do in that situation is we actually remove those calves from the cow for a period of 48 hours. But after the end of that 48 hours, we take the calf and put back with the cows. You say, well, we're not weaning it, so what impact does that have? Well, one of the things that impacts how quickly those cows come back into heat is suckling stimulus from the calf. And the more times a day it nurses, the longer it can take for that postpartum period. What we can do when we do the 48-hour calf removal, we can trick that cow's brain for her to start cycling quicker. Now, it's not 100%, but it does work very well. But here's the caveat to this 48-hour calf removal. It doesn't work on really thin cows. So if those cows are less than a body condition score 4, this is not the management practice we're going to implement. If you have some of those borderline cows between a 4 and a 5, this may be something we want to think about. Or a lot of times when you're thinking about first and second calf cows, people or especially on first calf cows, they'll come in here and do 48-hour calf removal. Now, another technique that's out there, it's once a day suckling, which when you're a university professor and you're sitting in the office and you have grad students to take care of all your labor, this seems like a pretty good deal because it works extremely well. And what you do is keep the calves in the pen and have the cows out grazing on the pasture, and once a day you let them nurse. Well, here's a little problem with that. You have to do it for 40 to 50 days to make it work. So when you think about it from a labor standpoint, theory, it's a great idea for a university professor. From a practical standpoint, it doesn't make any sense in my mind. So I usually cross that one off my list. And then the one I really thought that most of us were going to have to implement this year was early weaning. Go ahead and get those cows, get those calves off those cows so we can get them bred back. And when I talk about early weaning from a reproduction standpoint, we're talking about weaning those calves at 6 to 8 weeks of age. Well, why are we weaning them so early? Well, let's think about it this way. How often do we want that cow to have a calf? Every year. So every 365 days, right? What's the gestation length on a cow? Okay, I heard 280, 290. You know, typically 283, 285 on average is what we'll talk about. To keep the math simple, let's say 285 days. So if we have 365 in a year and her gestation length's 285 days, that means from calving until we rebreed her, we have 80 days. And once we go past 80 days, we're not going to maintain that yearly calving interval. So if that's the case, if we're going to do something, we need to get those calves off early. So if we think about an 8-week-old calf, that's 60 days. Well, is that cow going to come into heat the day we remove that calf? No, it's usually going to take a few weeks. 10 to 20 days typically is what we think about there. And so that's why we look at weaning those calves at 45 to 60 days, so we'll have enough time for those cows to come back in heat and get bred and maintain that yearly calving interval. Now, can we wean a calf that early? Absolutely. Are there some different management practices that we have to implement? Yes, but it's not that big of a deal. I won't go through all those, but if you are interested in looking at some early weaning, or you think, but based on where your cows are at, this is something you need to strongly consider, if you'll contact one of the beef cattle specialists, whether it's here at the Noble Foundation or at Oklahoma State or with AgriLife Extension, we can walk you through some of the things you want to do to make sure you're successful with this early weaning. So when we think about those calves at 6 to 8 weeks of age, this is the size calf we're talking about. And the same thing when we do that 48-hour calf removal, this is the size of calf we want to target. We want to target those calves that are 45 to 60 days of age when we pull them off of that cow to get her started again. Because if we do it on a calf that's 90 or 100 days old, we've already missed that opportunity for that yearly calving interval. How do you go about this to be more successful? One thing that works really good, and I'll tell you in our family operation, this is what we did this year, was 48-hour calf removal. In the fall, my plan was we were going to early wean, but because of this great winter pasture we had this year, we changed the plan and actually went to 48-hour calf removal. But you don't necessarily have to do every calf in the herd. So if you have some mature cows in with the younger cows, those mature cows are in good condition, maybe not pull the calves off of them. Leave them together, and then the cows with the young calves, rather than pulling the calves away and putting them in a different pen by themselves, leave them with those older cow-calf pairs and take those cows and pull them into a different pasture or a different lot. And those young calves, being in that herd that they're used to and familiar with, they'll stay a whole lot calmer, things will go smoother for you, plus those other cows will provide some protection to those calves. How many of you think that would be a wreck to try to do 48-hour calf removal? Sounds a little scary, doesn't it? All right? You'll just have to trust me, but try it. It's not near as bad as it sounds. We actually did that here 2 weeks ago on a set of cows. Worked really well, not any problems. Actually, we didn't have quite as much bellering and walking the fences doing that as you do at weaning time, which surprised me a little bit. But you do want to keep the cows next in the pasture next to the calves so they can see each other, and that helps reduce some of that stress. Plus keep those calves with those older cow-calf pairs. But that's something a lot of us really need to consider this year is 48-hour calf removal to help those pregnancy rates. Now, what are some other things you'll hear from time to time? Well, how many of you have heard people that are synchronizing cows for artificial insemination? They talk about different synchronization protocols where some of them may help bring those cows into estrus that are anestrus. When we talk about anestrus, that just means they're not cycling. Well, the components of those programs they're talking about are GnRH and progesterone. And yes, when we implement a synchronization protocol with those two compounds, we can bring some of those cows into heat before they were traditionally. Now, that's not going to work on thin cows, and here's the other problem. The response rate is extremely variable. You'll look at, in some cases, only about 10% of the cows are going to respond, and other ones about 80. This isn't something I would normally do or I would recommend doing when you're having a natural breeding program. But if you're going to be synchronizing in AI, that is something to do, is make sure you have those two products in your program. How many of you heard of nutritional flushing to get cows to breed better? It gets talked about from time to time, but really the results are extremely variable, and I don't think it's a real consistent situation, so I tend to lead to what I consider some of the more reliable programs. But there are times when we get really good gains on those cows after calving, it kind of flushes them a little bit and gets them to come back into heat quicker. But we're talking about gains in excess of 1 pound a day. Another one that you may have not heard about is bull exposure prior to the breeding season. And so even though the bulls aren't actually with the cows, if you take the bulls and put them in an adjacent pasture, you can actually get some of those first cows to come back into heat quicker. Doesn't always work real well on those mature cows, but it does on the younger females. But what's the big kicker here? How well does that work to keep that bull across the fence when there's cows cycling on the other side? Not real well. So again, makes a lot of sense from the university standpoint, very hard to implement. If you were going to try this, I'd probably want a really good pipe fence where those bulls are going to be, or a good fence with plenty of electric hot wire on it. There are no magic bullets out there. How many of you heard about fat supplementation or lipid supplementation influencing pregnancy rates? A lot of that in the popular press. I'll actually tell you a lot of the research that was done on that from a production standpoint was actually done here in Oklahoma at Oklahoma State. And when we look at this, will lipid supplementation impact reproduction? Yes, but here's the kicker. It doesn't impact pregnancy rates necessarily. What it does is changes the number and size of follicles, which follicles are the growth on the ovary that releases the egg. Well, how many eggs do you need to have to get a cow bred? 1. So increasing the number really doesn't help. I'll tell you, I do not think there's any reason to do lipid supplementation to try to influence reproduction. And I have a whole lot of firsthand experience with that. All of my dissertation work for my PhD program focused on that. And we could never make it work like you would think it would. So it gets talked about a whole lot. I don't think there's any real world application there. Another thing you hear people talk about is UIP supplementation, which is undegradable intake protein, which is just a fancy term for protein that's not broken down in the rumen, but is broken down in the small intestine. Again, when you really look at the data and go through it with a fine-tooth comb, I don't think there's any evidence to support that practice either. So if you hear about these tricks from a feeding standpoint that will impact your pregnancy rates, there's really not any good data to back those up. So we're back to the 48-hour calf removal or the early weaning we're talking about. But here's the key we always need to keep in mind is calve those cows in a good body condition score. So on those mature cows, that's 5 or greater at calving, and on those 2 and 3 year olds, we like to have them at a body condition score of 6 or greater. And those 2 things, if we do those, we can eliminate the rest of everything I just talked about. But everything else I just talked about are things we do when, because of weather, we can't get those cows in that situation. And then after calving, we just want to try to control the weight loss on those cows. If you are interested in early weaning or 48-hour calf removal, there's a really nice publication by a retired colleague of ours, L.R. Sprott, called Calf Removal. I'll give you a website here at the end that you can get that publication off the website. And it goes through the 48-hour calf removal, the once-day suckling, as well as the early weaning of calves. And then another nice publication, and probably one of the few in the nation, addressing how to manage and handle those early weaned calves, was written by Dave Lawman up at Oklahoma State, and it's titled Early Weaning for the Beef Herd. The best way to find it, Oklahoma State's website's kind of hard to navigate, is just Google early weaning for the beef cow herd in the name Lawman. If you can't find it, I'll be happy to email it to you if you contact me. And with that, I wanted to wrap up with one of our websites. It's beef.tamu.edu. Dr. Gill mentioned it before lunch. But if you'll come down here on the right-hand side and click on publications, there's all kind of publications, and that's where you can find that one by Dr. Sprott. With that, I'll be happy to entertain any questions. Okay, good question. His question was on early weaned calves, when are you going to vaccinate those calves? Ideally, we would want to do it a couple weeks before weaning and try to get that immune system kicked off and going. That's a situation where you're going to want to sit down with your veterinarian and come up with a specific plan for those calves, but definitely want to try to get at least one round of vaccine in those calves before weaning. Good question. Yes, sir. Okay, his question was he had read somewhere that a calf's rumen is not really developed until 4 months of age. And I'm going to tell you, rumen development really depends on how that calf is managed. The thing we need, and really at 4 months of age, that rumen may not be developed very well at that point either. What we do to make sure these early weaned calves, we can manage them right, is we actually look at the dairy industry and what are some of the things they do. And what we need to do is before we early wean, we want to try to expose those calves to grain for at least about 3 weeks before weaning. And the reason we want to do that is when that grain ferments, it releases a VFA called butyrate. That butyrate actually helps that rumen develop and grow. And it takes about 3 weeks from the time that calf first starts getting little grain until that rumen's going good enough where those calves do really good if we go to straight grain. And so we're going to feed the cow-calf pairs some grain together, and if you can put in a little creep feeder or a creep gate where you can get those calves a little grain before, we'll do that. And then at weaning, we'll actually take and go get us a dairy starter calf diet. That's typically going to be about 20 to 22% protein, and that's all we're going to feed. We're not going to feed any roughage at that point in time. I know we always talk about feeding cows roughage, which is huge. But that calf, because that rumen hasn't developed all the way, we can start it out on that straight high grain diet. And if we give them a little grain before weaning, and then when we wean, we put them on that diet, those calves that actually do pretty good, and we can get 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of gain through them. And if you feed them on out, typically the early weaned calves will weigh as much, if not more, than the calves we left on the cow. But the trick is get a little grain in them before weaning, and then at weaning, get them on that high protein, high energy diet. Did that answer your question or what you're looking at? Oh, I guess the other thing I was going to mention, as far as that rumen being fully developed, that's typically going to take 4 to 6 months of time, not necessarily at 4 months of age or 6 months of age, but 4 to 6 months of age once they start getting some butyrate production. And so if those calves are only on milk and we keep them on milk and nothing else, they won't start developing that rumen until after we get them off that milk, okay? In milk and grass, they develop the rumen a little bit better with the grass, but the real key is that grain. It really makes a lot of difference there. Good question. Okay, his question was, what effect does nighttime temperature have on that cow settling or embryo survival? Now I'm going to tell you it's not so critical as far as the nighttime temperature versus the daytime temperature, but the reason we talk about nighttime temperature is if that nighttime temperature is too high and that cow's heat stressed, and then at night she can't dissipate that excess heat, that has a big impact. So when we're in a heat stress situation, absolutely, it's critical. As far as the exact number, I'm not going to give you one, but it has a huge impact on those reproduction rates. And that's why we want to get that breeding season back more in the spring rather during the middle of the hot summer. But it's getting that excess heat dissipated. I'm on time, Hugh. Need to stop there?
Well, probably ought to stop and
all right. Well, thank you all very much. I'll be around for a little bit if you have